Job was a man who lived in the land of Uz, renowned not only for his incredible wealth, but also for his deep, unwavering faith in God. He wasn't a king or a prophet, but he was upright, honest, and devout, living a life that honored God in every way. Job was known to be the wealthiest man in the East. His prosperity was remarkable. He had vast estates, countless livestock, and numerous servants. His wealth seemed limitless, and his status was unmatched. However, despite all his material riches, Job's most treasured possession was his family. He had 10 children, 7 sons, and 3 daughters, and they lived together in harmony, sharing joyous occasions, feasting, and celebrating the many blessings they had received. Each morning, long before the sun rose, Job would wake up with a heavy heart and pray for his children. His love for them drove him to offer burnt sacrifices on their behalf, just in case one of them had unknowingly sinned or cursed God in their hearts. He knew how fragile life and blessings could be, and so he prayed out of love, not fear. It wasn't that he believed his children were living in sin, but he deeply understood the importance of maintaining a humble and repentant heart before God, and he sought to cover them in prayer, asking God to watch over them and keep them safe from harm. Job's relationship with God was marked by a deep reverence and respect. He did not take his blessings for granted, and his devotion was evident in his actions. In his mind, everything he had, his wealth, his health, and his family, was a gift from God. He didn't see himself as entitled to any of it, but recognized that all he possessed came from God's grace. His prayers for his children reflected his constant awareness of how fleeting and fragile these blessings could be. Job's faith was not just in the good times, but in the quiet moments of worship and surrender, offering himself and his family up to God every day. His life was an example of how faithfulness to God transcends earthly circumstances, showing a deep trust in his sovereignty, whether in times of plenty or, as we would soon see, in times of loss. In heaven, a conversation was unfolding that would change Job's life forever. Satan, the accuser, appeared before God along with the sons of God, who presented themselves before the Lord. As the Almighty gazed upon them, he spoke with great confidence about his servant Job, declaring that there was no one on earth like him, blameless, upright, and someone who feared God and shunned evil. But Satan, with a dark smile, challenged God's assessment of Job's faithfulness. He implied that Job's righteousness was not born from genuine devotion, but from the protection and blessings that God had surrounded him with. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan sneered. He argued that Job's faithfulness was simply a result of the wealth, health, and family he had, and if those things were taken away, Job would surely curse God. Satan's accusation was clear. Job's devotion was contingent on his earthly prosperity. To prove Satan wrong, God allowed Job to be tested. He gave Satan permission to take away all of Job's material blessings and even his family. However, God placed one restriction: Job himself was to remain untouched. Satan eagerly accepted the challenge, believing that if Job lost everything, he would turn against God in despair. With this, the trial began. The next day, everything in Job's life was turned upside down. In the blink of an eye, his wealth was gone, his livestock stolen, and his servants killed by raiders. And as if that wasn't devastating enough, news arrived that his children had been killed in a tragic accident when a mighty wind caused the collapse of their house. The pain was incomprehensible. Job, who had once stood at the peak of prosperity, was now left with nothing but ashes and grief. Yet in the face of these overwhelming losses, Job did not curse God. Instead of giving in to despair, he remained steadfast. His response was both humbling and profound. He tore his clothes in mourning, shaved his head, and fell to the ground in worship. His heart, broken as it was, still clung to God. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart." The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Job's faith was not dependent on his possessions, his health, or his family. It was rooted in his trust in the goodness and sovereignty of God. Even in the face of devastating loss, he chose to honor and worship the Lord, showing that true faith is not contingent on circumstances, but on the unshakable belief in God's nature. Human experience. His faith was not conditional on receiving only good things from God. Job had learned that faith is about accepting both the blessings and the trials. Job's response was a powerful reminder of the importance of steadfast faith in the face of unimaginable pain. He chose not to let his suffering dictate his relationship with God. Instead, he reaffirmed his trust in God's sovereignty, even in the midst of hardship. Job's unwavering commitment to God, even when everything seemed lost, demonstrated a faith that was not rooted in circumstances, but in the unchanging character of God. In the face of all that had gone wrong, Job stood firm in his belief that God was still worthy of worship and praise. Sovereignty of God. His declaration was a powerful reminder that life itself, and all the blessings that come with it, are not ours to possess permanently, but rather, they are entrusted to us by God. Despite the depth of his pain, Job's heart remained humble and open before God. He did not demand answers or question why God had allowed such suffering. Instead, he chose to worship. In that moment, Job demonstrated what true faith looks like, not faith in God for what he can give, but faith in God for who he is. This is the faith that withstands the hardest trials, the kind of faith that clings to God even when everything else falls apart. Job's actions revealed the depth of his trust in God's character. He understood that even in the darkest of times, God was still sovereign and worthy of praise. Job did not know why he was suffering, but he knew that God was still good. His response was a testimony to his resilience and his unwavering faith. In a moment when most would have given in to despair, Job stood firm. He showed us that even in the face of unthinkable loss, true faith is not about understanding why things happen, but about trusting God and choosing to honor Him no matter the circumstances. Job's response was in itself an act of victory over despair, over bitterness, and over the temptation to turn away from God. As Job's suffering deepened, the physical pain became unbearable. After losing his wealth and his children, Job was struck with a dreadful disease that covered his body in painful sores. His once healthy skin, which had been a symbol of his vitality and prosperity, was now raw and infected. The sores itched and burned, and each movement sent waves of excruciating pain through his body. Job, the man who had once stood tall as the wealthiest and most respected in the East, was now a broken figure, sitting in the ashes, scraping his wounds with a shard of pottery. His body had become a grotesque reflection of his inner torment. Amidst this agony, Job's wife, who had witnessed the complete unraveling of their life, approached him in despair. She had seen their wealth vanish, their children die, and now she watched her husband wither away in front of her. Her heart was broken, and the overwhelming weight of grief led her to speak words that reflected her own hopelessness. She suggested, "Do you still hold on to your integrity, curse God, and die?" To her, it seemed that there was no point in continuing to endure such a miserable existence. In her eyes, the only way out of their suffering was through death. Yet Job's response to her words revealed the strength of his faith and his understanding of God's sovereignty. He didn't lash out in anger or give in to his wife's despairing words. Instead, Job looked at her and replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" Despite the overwhelming pain he was enduring, Job recognized that life is not solely about receiving blessings and happiness. He understood that life, in all its aspects, comes from God, and that suffering, just like joy, is part of the human experience. Human experience. His faith was not conditional on receiving only good things from God. Job had learned that faith is about accepting both the blessings and the trials. Job's response was a powerful reminder of the importance of steadfast faith in the face of unimaginable pain. He chose not to let his suffering dictate his relationship with God. Instead, he reaffirmed his trust in God's sovereignty, even in the midst of hardship. Job's unwavering commitment to God, even when everything seemed lost, demonstrated a faith that was not rooted in circumstances, but in the unchanging character of God. In the face of all that had gone wrong, Job stood firm in his belief that God was still worthy of worship and praise. When Job's 3 friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar heard of his suffering, they immediately set out to visit him, traveling from distant lands to offer their support. They had been friends for many years, and they were horrified to learn of the tragedy that had befallen him. As they arrived in the land of Uz, they saw Job sitting among the ashes, his body covered in painful sores, a shadow of the man he once was. The sight of him was so overwhelming that they could hardly recognize him. For a moment, they were speechless, gripped by the sheer magnitude of his suffering. In their deep sorrow, the 3 friends sat down with Job, and for 7 days and 7 nights, they said nothing. They sat in complete silence, sharing in his grief. This was their way of offering comfort, by simply being there with him in his pain. Job's suffering was so profound that no words could possibly ease his torment, and they understood that sometimes the greatest comfort comes from quiet presence rather than spoken advice. They wept with him, and in a way, their silence honored the depth of his sorrow. However, as the days passed, the silence grew unbearable, and eventually, Job opened his mouth. His lament was not aimed at God, but rather, he cursed the day of his birth, wishing he had never been born at all. His pain was so great that he longed for death, feeling that it would be a release from his anguish. He questioned the meaning of his existence and cried out in deep distress, wondering why he had been brought into a world where suffering was so relentless. Job's words shook his friends to the core, and they could not remain silent any longer. Eliphaz, the oldest of the 3, was the first to speak, but his words cut deeply. He began by reminding Job of the wisdom he had once shared with others, but now, in the face of his own suffering, he seemed to have lost all hope. Eliphaz's words implied that Job's suffering was a result of his own sin. He suggested that God was punishing Job for something he had done wrong, and that Job needed to repent to find healing. This advice, though well-intentioned, was deeply misguided. Eliphaz's reasoning was based on the belief that suffering was always the result of personal sin. This view, though common in his time, did not acknowledge the possibility of innocent suffering. Job was stunned by his friend's words. Instead of offering the comfort he so desperately needed, Eliphaz's harsh words felt like another blow to his already broken spirit. Job's suffering had no apparent reason, and his friend's accusations only deepened his pain. But Job refused to accept their judgment. He knew he had lived righteously, and he struggled to understand why he was facing such torment. This exchange between Job and his friends marks the beginning of a long and painful dialogue, one in which Job would seek to understand his suffering and his relationship with God, while his friends tried to make sense of what was happening in terms of their own beliefs about divine justice. As Job's suffering continued, his grief reached new depths. The pain in his body was unbearable, and the emotional weight of losing his children, his wealth, and his health crushed him from the inside. Job had always been a man who trusted in God's justice and sovereignty, but now, in the middle of his suffering, he found himself struggling to understand why it was happening to him. The pain was too much to bear, and he began to question everything, even the purpose of his own life. Job had always been a man of integrity, and he had lived his life faithfully, yet now he was faced with a reality that made no sense. The torment he endured seemed endless, and he cried out to God, desperate for answers. In the depths of his despair, Job spoke words that reflected the hopelessness he felt. He cursed the day he was born, wishing that he had never existed. He longed for an escape from the pain, even if it meant never having been brought into the world at all. His lament was raw and honest, an expression of the agony of a soul that could no longer endure the weight of suffering. "Why did I not perish at birth?" he cried. "Why was I not buried as soon as I came from the womb?" The sorrow in his words was overwhelming, as he questioned the meaning of his existence and why he had been subjected to such unbearable suffering. Job's pain was not just physical, it was a deep existential anguish. He struggled with the very nature of his existence and the apparent injustice of his suffering. He didn't demand answers from God. Rather, he expressed his confusion and heartache, lamenting that his life seemed pointless. "What did I do to deserve this?" he asked, unable to comprehend why he was being punished in this way. Job felt abandoned by everyone, even by God, who he had always trusted to be just and merciful. The cries of his heart echoed in the silence, and Job felt that death would be a release from his agony. But despite his intense pain, Job's cries were not directed at God with anger or accusation. Instead, they came from a place of raw vulnerability. Job was not asking for answers as much as he was reaching out for relief. He was trying to make sense of a world that no longer seemed fair, and he needed to express his pain in words. Job's lament was not an act of rebellion, but an honest cry from a man who was grappling with the deepest sorrow he had ever known. His journey through this intense period of suffering would lead him to wrestle with questions of faith, justice, and the nature of God. But for now, his heart was heavy with the question, why? In the midst of Job's overwhelming sorrow and confusion, God finally responded to his cries. But rather than offering the explanations or answers that Job had so desperately sought, God spoke to him in a way that Job had never expected. God's voice thundered from a storm, a powerful and awe-inspiring presence that filled the air with a sense of divine authority. Job, who had been longing for understanding, now found himself standing before the Almighty, not in the way he had envisioned, but in a completely different way. God did not give him the reasons behind his suffering, nor did he explain why Job had been subjected to such pain. Instead, God asked Job a series of questions that focused on the vastness of creation and the majesty of his own sovereignty. "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" God asked. "Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know." Job had no answers to these questions. He had no understanding of how the universe worked or how the natural world operated. God's questions revealed the incomprehensible scale of creation and the limitations of human understanding. Job had been consumed by his own suffering, seeking to understand the purpose behind it. But God pointed him to the greater reality, the grandeur of the world he had created, and the immense wisdom behind it. God continued to question Job about the wonders of creation, the forces of nature, the creatures of the earth, and the mysteries of the universe. Job was asked if he could control the seas or command the morning light. He was reminded that God alone holds power over the vastness of the cosmos, and that even the mightiest creatures like Behemoth and Leviathan are under God's control. These creatures, which no human could challenge, were a reminder of God's unmatched strength and the insignificance of humanity in comparison to his divine power. As God spoke, Job's heart began to change. His doubts, his need for answers, and his desire for justice faded into the background. He realized that he had been asking the wrong questions all along. The real issue was not why he was suffering, but the recognition of who God truly is: sovereign, wise, and beyond human comprehension. Job understood that God did not owe him an explanation. Instead of demanding answers, Job humbled himself in awe before the Creator. "I know that you can do all things," Job said. "No purpose of yours can be thwarted. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." In this moment, Job's perspective shifted. He no longer needed the answers he thought would bring him peace. What he needed was a deeper understanding of God's glory. And in that understanding, he found peace. Job had encountered God in his power and majesty, and that encounter was enough. After Job's encounter with God, everything changed. God's words had pierced through Job's questions and doubts, leaving him with a deeper understanding of the divine mystery. Job had asked for answers, seeking an explanation for his suffering. But God did not offer simple answers. Instead, he revealed his grandeur and sovereignty, reminding Job that there were things beyond human comprehension. Job's suffering was never explained, but he was given something far greater: a direct encounter with the Creator, who revealed his immense power, wisdom, and justice. In that moment, Job realized the limitations of his own understanding. The universe, with all its wonders, was under God's control, and human suffering, though painful and perplexing, did not negate the goodness of God. Job's faith was no longer about getting the answers he wanted, but about trusting in God's wisdom and sovereignty, even when everything seemed uncertain. "I know that you can do all things," Job declared. "No purpose of yours can be thwarted." Job's heart, once filled with confusion and despair, now surrendered in humble worship. He acknowledged that he had spoken without full understanding, and he repented for questioning God's justice. In this profound moment of surrender, Job found peace, not in the answers, but in the presence of God. The story of Job is a powerful reminder that sometimes we may never fully understand the reasons behind our struggles and suffering. Like Job, we often want clear answers, explanations, or resolutions to our pain. But life doesn't always work that way. We may face moments of profound loss, disappointment, and confusion, and it's natural to wonder why. Yet, the story of Job shows us that true peace doesn't always come from understanding why things happen, but from trusting in the character of God, who is good, sovereign, and just, even when life doesn't make sense. In our own lives, we may find ourselves in seasons of suffering, where everything seems to be falling apart. It's easy to question why these things are happening to us, especially when we feel we don't deserve them. But just as Job experienced, there can be moments when we shift our focus from seeking answers to simply trusting in the God who holds everything in his hands. Job's story challenges us to look beyond our immediate circumstances and recognize that God is present in every moment, even in the midst of our pain. Just like Job, we can find comfort not in having all the answers, but in knowing that the God who created the world also cares deeply for us, and his plans for our lives are filled with wisdom, even when we can't see them clearly.